Hello everyone, I'm Ølnes. I'm tribe lead, as it's called in our organization, mainly for signing and trust services at Signicat. We should have been 4 speakers today, but unfortunately my colleague Antti Kela has got sick, so he can't join, but I'm joined by 2 other excellent speakers. Sandor Welfing from our dear partner and customer Rabobank, and our Chief Information Security Officer Thomas Kjøglum. So yes, over to you first, Sandor, for some words from you.
Well, I'm glad I can be here today. My name is Sandor Welfing, as mentioned, and I work for Rabobank in the procurement and vendor management area. And my main concern is risk management for all our supplier landscape.
Thanks. And Thomas, over to you.
Yes, as mentioned, my name is Thomas Kjøglum, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Signicat. And I'll give a brief introduction to how we work with and think about compliance in Signicat today.
Good. So let's have some slides. And I guess we've seen the pictures live. So what we'll be looking into is EBA Guidelines for Remote Onboarding, EBA Outsourcing Guidelines, and the link is, of course, that if you want to outsource remote onboarding, you need to do it according to the Outsourcing Guidelines. Thomas will tell us a bit more about how Signicat work on compliance, and Sandor will give us Rabobank's compliance perspective. So, what are the EBA guidelines for remote onboarding? Why is this an initiative and what happens? Well, firstly, European Banking Authority is an EU agency, and they're actually empowered to give guidelines and standards that apply, well, not quite as EU law, but almost in that direction. They are normative, right? So they're set to establish a single set of rules applicable to all banking institutions in the EU. Means it's harmonized across the EU member states. This also includes the other EEA countries, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. If you want to have a single market, an internal market, you need harmonized rules, you need an equal playing field. That goes for sure. So what it's often called is the European single rule book in banking that the EBA is providing. So guidelines that we're touching upon now, they do not override the national law. I mean, if you get a guideline and it's incompatible, it breaks what is law in your country, you can't follow it. But apart from that, supervisory authorities and the financial institutions, the providers, must make every effort to comply. That's the statement. And if you don't comply in a country, if the supervisory authority doesn't adjust the rules accordingly, then you must give reasons why not. Okay, so where are we on this? So we have the playing field, the European Banking Authority setting the rules, the competent authorities enforcing them in the individual countries. Credit and financial institutions are subject to these rules, and then we have all the vendors, the supply chain industry and whatnot, like where Signicat plays a role. So call them regulatory technology vendors in this case. Why harmonize remote onboarding? Well, it's starting point, I think best way of explaining it is the starting point from the current anti-money laundering directives. These are directives, right? It means there are EU rules, but they need to be implemented in national law by the individual countries. And this is done differently. And especially when AML Article 13 says identifying the customer, verifying customer's identity on the basis of identification process regulated, recognized, approved, or accepted by the relevant national authorities. So each country is free to accept what they see fit, as long as it's secure. So different national requirements, and it surely hampers the internal market. EU Commission, of course, realized this. So they put out the EU Digital Finance Strategy in 2020. This is quite a big strategy with lots of different topics. But in this area, remove fragmentation of the digital single market by defining a framework, and authenticate the identity of the customers, defining by means of technical standards. Well, it ended up as guidelines, but never mind. Of the European Banking Authority, identification and authentication elements for customer onboarding purposes. So setting standards, guidelines by EBA for this purpose is part of the strategy. And the next one is that by 2024, no, please go back one. In 2024, we should have a harmonized legal framework, which also includes enable customer data to be reused. That's part of it. If I sign up with a bank, and soon afterwards I'll sign up for an insurance company, it should be possible for me to get the verified identity information from the bank and share it with the insurance company. That's also part of the strategy. So yes, next one. So on onboarding, the strategy says convergence of elements related to identification and verification, and without the need to apply different processes or comply with additional requirements in each member states. This is music to Signicat, right? We serve customers in many, many countries, and what we do now is we need to check the national regulations and what that will be. So to us, it's possible to provide a harmonized service to finance institutions. It will be possible to use those harmonized rules and do the same thing in every country we operate. So timeline and recommendations here. The guidelines are pretty new. They were published in April. And then, as we mentioned, the competent authorities need to report, do they comply or not, or do they intend to comply? And that was in the middle of this year. And the guidelines took effect October. And yeah, what changes do competent authorities need to make? We don't know yet for those that reported that they are not yet compliant. And we assume the anticipation is that we will get an anti-money laundering regulation, not a directive, but a regulation, which means it will be a common EU law on top of national laws, and that this AML regulation will have an implementing act or paragraphs covering remote onboarding, likely 2025. Maybe it will be 2026, but let's assume 2025 by now. Compliance with the remote onboarding guidelines. 19 countries have reported, yes, we are compliant. 12 state that they intend to comply. They're not yet compliant, but they're working on it. We don't know the timelines, but it goes that direction. And there's one country, Estonia, that apparently hasn't answered yet. And these are then the additional EEA state, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, in addition to the member state, and also the European Central Bank. And some states have more than one authority. There may be more answers, but largely, knowing Estonia, I don't believe they will be a non-compliant over time. So this will take force in all European countries. What are the recommendations? Well, they are for identifying a customer, which may be a natural or a legal person. And also, how do you store the evidence from the onboarding process? How do you prove in retrospect that you did the onboarding in a compliant way and over time? So it has essentially two ways of doing remote identity proofing. First one is use of electronic identification schemes, EIDs, and trust services, meaning in this case digital signatures. If you sign a document, of course, your identity information will be in the signing certificate, so you can use that as a proof of identity, or you can authenticate by using an electronic identification means. So referring to the well-established European levels for electronic identification schemes, substantial is enough. EU has defined the levels low, substantial, and high, and substantial is a good level for onboarding to financial services. That's also common practice in most countries today. Trust services like signing, and that's also emphasized that you need a risk-based approach for all the onboarding. Use of identity documents remotely, you can, I mean, that means you're in the user, the person that needs to be onboarded is in front of a mobile phone or a PC with a camera, and will show an identity document and also show the face. The preferred option is to read the chip of an identity document. Passports and most identity cards will have a chip that has the identity information in digital form. But you can also do optical scanning of a physical identity document, like a passport or a national identity card. Then you do a video capture of a video sequence of a customer face. A picture, just a photo, is not enough. You need some liveness checks there to make sure there's a live person in front of the camera. And then you match the photo to the pictures you get from the identity documents. And if there's a match, you have a proven identity from the identity document. And if there are some doubts, you can enhance by the risk-based approach. Well, you could use electronic identification means, authenticate, and then also show an identity document. But you can also use proof of a payment transaction out of an account that a person owns. You can use mechanisms like one-time passwords sent by email or by SMS. And you can use other ways of comparing to biometric data, face photos that you already have collected by other means. So it's quite broad, and it quite well aligns with what we see in best practice for remote identity proofing in other areas. For legal person, well, identify, verify the legal person, but then you firstly verify that there is a physical person there, right, representing the legal person, that this is the that you verify the identity of this person, for example, by using the means mentioned in the previous slide, verify the authorization of that person, and then also identify beneficial owners and what is the purpose and nature of the business relationship. And all this is, of course, linked to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing. So there's a new recommendation, new part of it, says that for storing evidence of the onboarding process, keep information, gather information and documents that you need to store away the evidence, and then timestamp and securely store them. And that enables, for example, if the financial supervisory authority comes your way, then you can pick it up and say, yeah, here's evidence that I did the remote identity proofing, the remote onboarding in a compliant way. So we got a poll here. We want to ask you a few questions on the way. So what's the biggest remote onboarding related challenge you see in your organization? Is it collecting customer identification? Is it storing or utilizing this identification related information? Checking the representation, authorizations of a person? Monitoring, identifying when something is not as it should be, deviations, automation, getting rid of a lot of manual work, or do you have some other topics? We leave that on the screen for a minute or so, see where we are. Still answers coming in, so we also see there are some votes on each of them. Yeah, we see automation is and the collecting of the customer identification related information. Automation is also an interesting topic for this remote onboarding, because I mean, if you do it by use of an electronic identification means, you can likely do it fully automated. If you use an identity document remotely, there are certain services that work fully automated, and other services work in a way that there is a human eye on the evidence. So the comparison between the photo obtained from the identity document and the photo obtained from the video sequence could be done partly automated and partly manual, or it can in some instances be done fully automated, which of course saves a lot of money and saves a lot of manual work if you can do it fully automated, but it's also a risk-based decision if you want to do it like that. So yeah, that's automation. It's collecting customer identification related information, and it's monitoring and identifying deviations. Those are the top ones. So good input, thanks. Okay, so you want to do remote onboarding according to the to those guidelines, and you want to outsource this on to a supplier, for example, Signicat. We would love you to do that, of course. But that means there's another guideline that comes into play here, and that's the EBA guideline on outsourcing agreements. This takes, of course, the perspective of the financial service provider. It places requirements on financial service providers' outsourcing arrangements, and this is enforced by, I mean, all EU states have stated compliance to this one, except possibly one, but never mind. This applies everywhere. So Thomas, that means over to you, and what we do to ensure that if you select us as a vendor in this case, you are covered.
Yes, and there's two main aspects of this that we often see as we are usually categorized as a critical part in the outsourcing evaluation. So then it's the information needed by the customer so that they are able to do the risk assessment that they need to do. And then there's also the support in the audit perspective. So I'm going to now do a quick overview of how we try to look at compliance and then try to support our customers to achieve these requirements with the information that we are able to support them. So building on the principle that most standards and frameworks are using the same principles as guidelines, we then believe that we use the same underlying principles to secure our business as our customers. And from a very high level, this means basically establishing a context, risk, and leadership, having an overview of what we would like to protect from an inventory perspective and classifying and documenting this, and then implementing and operating security controls to manage the risk that we have identified. And And lastly, monitor, evaluate, and improve on where we are. So we have built our information security management system on the recognized and well-known standard ISO 27001, and we have also added the 27018 to this framework. And of course, as we have some products that are nationally specific, we have or industry specific, we have some other well-known standards as well, which is then the ETSI and EIDAS requirements and the national adaptations of the security European security frameworks. So the idea with the previous slide, please. So the idea with this setup is that when we receive new requirements, we have kind of a bucket on top where we then input all the requirements and then see if they match any of the lower level documentations and standards that we have already implemented. Yes, so from a practical view, this means that we take new requirements let's use DORA as an example. We do either a gap analysis or a statement of applicability. This depends on what use case of the new requirement is. If it's a standard that we would like to certify against, then we need a statement of applicability. If it's just a new requirement or a framework, then we do a gap analysis and then try to map it to existing requirements. And if there are any that doesn't match, then we update the information security management system, and that could be a policy, a procedure, or a standard, basically. So this is the outcome of this process is then either a gap analysis or a statement of applicability. This is usually an Excel document or similar, meaning a table of some sort. But one of the questions we often get when we review these documents with people that are in an operational point of view is, why do we have this requirement? Could we change it to something else? And one of the ways that we have implemented the reference back from the implemented policies, procedures, and standards is then to mention that this requirement comes from this framework. So as an example here, we have the source of our policy, the asset classification policy, where we then have the Annex A of the ISO requirement as a fundamental basis, and then the DORA requirement for the specific parts, which then requires a business impact assessment being part of the classification evaluation. That's how we have implemented it. Yes, and then of course it's to support our customers in meeting the information needs. We then use, as we have standard frameworks and known standards, we then have also a standard audit program. So we have the ISO 27001 as a foundation. And then on top of this, we build on the qualified trust service provider certificate, and additionally the SOC 2 Type 2 to verify the effectiveness of the security controls that we have. And we are still using the same information security management system to then also verify the adherence to the local requirements of the Dutch EIDs, the Finnish EIDs, and the Danish EIDs, where we are a broker. Yes. So meeting the expectations of our customers, we then try to support with the information that they need to then provide for that what they need to do a correct and accurate risk assessment. But there will always be a dialogue and cooperation, because even though we have the same principles, we might talk in this different dialects or levels when it comes to requirements. So there will always be a need for communication to align on the expectations. And then, of course, when there's a need for additional information, we try to be as open and transparent as possible and allow for our customers to perform audits on us as per the outsourcing guidelines from EBA.
Thanks, Thomas. So I forgot to mention it at the start, but please ask questions. There is a questions possibility in the view you have. We got a few questions already. We would like to have more, and we'll handle the questions at the end this time. But then, I mean, you aren't here just to listen to Signicat. It's better to get it from one of the banks that are subject to these regulations. So over to you, Sandor, Rabobank's perspective.
No, thank you very much, Jon. So yeah, I want to take you through a bit of a journey and explaining how we as a bank need to deal with all the various rules and regulations as it regards to supplier third-party risk management. So if we go to the next here, I just want to give a context for how you can understand our position. So if you look at overall supply risk management and you look at in terms of money, we have approximately 7 billion a year in operating expenses as a bank, but 2.5, and actually increasingly, this is a little bit old data, but it's probably closer to 3 billion a year we spend on third parties. Now it's almost obvious to say, but there's strict regulatory oversight on this spend. And depending on the particular regulations that you have, infractions can result in quite large fines. So we need to have the internal control of all these risks. For a number of areas, which I can highlight in a moment, but there are a number that have mandatory reporting requirements and deadlines, and both internal and external audits that we have to do. So in other words, if you look at all this money that we're spending on third parties, which is only increasing, we have quite a job to do to remain in control and to answer our regulators on the risks. But also, most importantly, it's not just giving an answer to the regulator, it's about being in control as a company. So the more things that you outsource, for example, to a third party, the more things that are essentially, in essence, feels like out of your control. And you need to take extra steps in order to ensure you remain in control. Let me go to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things, but the blue table on the left-hand side, these are just a sample of all the different risk areas or themes that we need to actually manage. So for all of these themes, we have quite a comprehensive process in order to ask all these questions of our suppliers, depending on the risk of the relationship and what kind of services we consume. But I think in this context, especially when dealing with a company like Signicat or other similar services, the two that spring out primarily in this context would be outsourcing and the to be implemented standards for DORA. It doesn't mean things like business continuity management or recovery and resolution or security and privacy are any less important. But I think in this context, it'd be handy to point those out. And on the right-hand side, I just mentioned a few points that, for example, DORA is quite a far-reaching legislation. And really, it's aspiring to get companies, both their IT providers and the companies that consume their services, to have a much deeper insight in the relationship between them and where the dependencies sit. So yeah, it's for us, suppliers that can show regulatory compliance, in the end, have an advantage over those who cannot. Can't or doesn't wish to provide compliance information in the manner that's required, it becomes increasingly difficult as a supplier to do business in this market. So yeah. Really shortly, I think insights from our perspective, from what we see, is there's no escaping it. Suppliers need to provide the adequate answers during the onboarding process, and as shown on the previous slide, for a wide variety of risk areas. And it comes back every year. So there's yearly reassessments for the highest risk contracts. So it includes also your insurance documentation. Some of that were pointed out by Thomas on the previous slide, your SOC 2 and the other ISO certifications. But what we also see is that, and that's in the last point, we're not necessarily permitted as a financial institution to only rely on external certification. Increasingly so, we receive pressure from our regulators to perform external audits. And that is a growing need there. So now, one of the interesting things about DORA, and I wanted to point that out, I don't know, maybe you all know this already, but it's interesting in DORA is that...
We got a question actually, Sandor. Right. What is DORA? Could you explain it a little bit further than just the acronym?
Yeah, it was mentioned on the previous slide, but I guess there are the name only, but it's the Digital Organizational Resilience Act. And essentially, it's a EU-based regulation that requires all regulated industries, at least anyway, to have a much broader and deeper insight into the IT landscape. Now, the goal of this, of course, is in the name. It's the Resilience Act. So it's really about ensuring that whatever you outsource or whatever you ask a third party to do for you on your behalf remains fully in control.
This is going to be active by beginning of 2025, right? So there's 1 year to go before this comes into force.
Yeah, if you look at the deadlines, the having your internal systems modified to be able to manage this, collect the data for all your related IT contracts, and then there's a reporting deadline initially of January 2025. So in essence, for regulated companies, time is short. Yeah. Now, I will say, fortunately, some of this work in DORA, some of the groundwork has already been laid down by 2 other regulations, excuse me, that we've had to comply with, and that is recovery and resolution, in which we need to show links between critical processes, IT systems, and contracts. Though the scoping of recovery and resolution is different than DORA. So it's much broader in DORA. The second one is outsourcing. In outsourcing, in the EBA guidelines, you are required to show subcontractors as well. So there's different elements that are built up in other regulations that help for DORA compliance, but DORA goes a step further.
Yeah, also when it comes to who the subject to this regulation is, because as a provider, ICT provider to the financial institutions, Signicat is directly subject to the regulation itself.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, and maybe to point, I mean, there's lots of things in the DORA regulation, all the 50 articles or so, 45 or 50 articles. But one I found quite interesting, and that is in the technical specifications of the so-called ITS documentation. It specifies a new level of data collection that I don't think, I would dare say no company is doing it yet. And it requires a database, a very specifically determined database and a structure that shows your critical processes, your IT functions, all the related IT providers, and lots of other information all bound together in one reportable database for January of 2025. And that will be a challenge for every institution. So my message is really, if you're not already started, start. If you're subject to this, and then get close to your suppliers to understand what they need to deliver, so they can also understand what they need to deliver as well. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know if there's more questions, but maybe that one element that I wanted to point out on the one slide was that is different, is that DORA now demands that we have a hierarchy of subcontractors. Just something new that we haven't yet done. So in outsourcing, you have to list material subcontractors. But in DORA, they say, well, is it a tier 1? Is it a tier 2? Is it a tier 3 subcontractor? And that information needs to be maintained by the financial institution that needs to be reporting on this. So it's a whole new level of data collection, which you're really dependent on your suppliers to help you manage and gather.
And of course, trust your suppliers to do it correctly, even though you can't control them, but yeah.
That's also true, yeah. So it's, in other words, the regulatory demands are not going down with this. So on one hand, there's a simplification, And I also appreciate the regulation in terms of driving the quality of insights into IT landscapes even higher in this increasingly outsourced way of working. But on the other hand, yeah, it requires effort on both suppliers and the takers of those services to improve their processes, actions, data collection, reporting, and measurement.
Thanks, Sandor. Great. This is so closely related to what we started from, the topic of this webinar. So I'm happy we spent some time on it. We got a second poll upcoming. So what specific challenges do you encounter in collection of identification data? I mean, this was one of the major problems you identified in the first poll. But what is the main challenge you see? Utilizing electronic identification means or information from signing certificates? Do you use remote onboarding, photographs and video using that? Is that a challenge to you? Verifying the photos and the match, collecting the documents, strong online identity verification internationally, like cross borders. How can you use an electronic identification means of another country? Or checks done after the onboarding. What do you believe are the most challenging that you find in the collection of identification data and in the remote onboarding? We'll keep that for a minute or so and see how this works out. So what we see, of course, is that, or what we know is that in some countries like the Nordics, Netherlands, Baltics, some others, there's a preference to using existing electronic identification means, because like in Norway, everyone has a bank ID, so you use that one typically. But in countries where you don't have that infrastructure, you need to do it by other means. And also, of course, if you're a service provider in the Nordics or in the Netherlands, like Rabobank, you need to do something when you onboard customers from countries where you don't find this CID infrastructure in place. So this is a quite even game, almost the same on each of them. We'll give it another 15 seconds. And conclude that it's not really one single item that is singled out as the main problem here. It's more like there are different ways of looking into it. Okay. Guess we can do some slides at the end, but how can you comply by using Signicat services? What's our offer here? Well, firstly, this use of electronic identification means we mentioned, and it's definitely not widespread in all countries of Europe, but there's quite a good palette of EIDs that we have integrated in our Identity Hub, and of course these are available. Last edition was SPID in Italy, and we're adding increasingly more. We offer identity document-based identity verification. Could be chip-in document, or it could be scan of a physical identity document. Image-based, video-based, it depends on the level you need, and it depends on which geography you are in, what mechanism we have. We have 4 or 5 different options available in it. We have also the possibility to combine methods and do different things together, as was mentioned in this risk-based approach, where you can use other mechanisms to step up. Yeah. We have, regarding this timestamp and store security requirement, we recently launched a service that seems to be a perfect fit for that. That's the digital evidence management, where you input data elements and metadata. Some could be defined according to the context, and some metadata is standard metadata. And we use a qualified timestamping service to stamp the evidence, and you can store it away. And this also has a time to live parameter, meaning we guarantee that after that expiry time, everything is deleted. So you can store away the evidence for the time needed and not for longer, which is quite important because there's personal data in there, right? A qualified timestamp, according to the EU ADAS regulation, shall be assumed to guarantee the correct timing of an event and the integrity of the data it protects. So it's a quite strong evidence when you use a qualified timestamp for this. Our aim is to be a one-stop shopping actor for all identity-related services, including, of course, onboarding and that and related topics. So we have a contract that fulfills the requirements of these EBA guidelines, customer onboarding solutions, and also outsourcing agreements. So you can get it in reality. Everything from us is that's our claim and what we offer. Includes more than 100 data sources, registers, and the like that we can check for AML and know your customer purposes. We got recently launched a no-code workflow design called Mint that you can use to set up your flows. We also got a product for more advanced flows called the risk orchestration product. And at the bottom of everything is, like Thomas explained, all the certification, compliance, audits, and whatnot we are subject to, and that we keep up to speed on. DORA being the next one, of course, that's on the radar and in work at us. One part of the EBA guidelines is the ability to get physical access to the data center if needed. We have that guarantee also in place. So questions. We have a few. First one is, speaking of EU directives and regulations and such, will the NIS2 directive, the Network and Information Security Directive, be applied to any of these actors? I know we're looking into it at Signicat, Thomas. I don't know if you have any remarks on that.
Yeah, when EIDAS 2 comes, we as a trust service provider will be subject to it. So from a Signicat perspective, I know that's how it will be applicable. But from a financial institution perspective, maybe Sandor knows.
Yeah, that would probably be more just outside my level of experience, more on the security side of things, to be fair. So no, I don't really have an update on that.
That's okay. Would all this compliance stuff be covered by a good ISMS program? Is that what you need? You cover it all within the ISMS, or do you need more?
If you have a good ISMS and are aware that these requirements apply to you, then you have a framework where you then could iterate on the new requirements. So the ISMS is just a framework to work with new stuff, and then making sure that you cover or update your requirements and then adhere to and are aligned to the new stuff. So I would say if you have a good ISMS and make sure that you also get the feedback that you need from the external resources or the scope that you are within, then it would cover it, but it's not so it still needs a gap analysis to verify that all the specifics that are mentioned in any new requirements are actually already identified or not identified.
Thanks. There is another question specific. How does Rabobank work with Signicat, Sandor?
Well, I think we do. Well, obviously, the services that Signicat provides is for remote customer onboarding. That's pretty obvious. And if I look at some of sort of the specifics in there, maybe just to give a flavor to the relationship, what I understand is that almost 72% of their customers have been onboarded through remote online boarding in 2022. So there's over 70% that have been onboarded using that experience. So that's quite a fair amount. There's for remote onboarding there's two kinds of services. There's the NFC and the OCR, as explained earlier in the presentation. About 84% goes via NFC and about 16% goes via OCR. So in this case, the customers don't appear to experience any difference between the onboarding process between the two. And if there was an area that is more needs attention, if you will, from in terms of fraud or whatnot, that would be more in the OCR as opposed to the NFC area. So maybe that just gives a bit of a flavor for how Rabobank works with Signicat.
Thank you, Sandor. We got one. Will e-wallets also be part of your one-stop shop? And I think I can answer that one. Wallets these days refer mainly to the initiative from the European Digital Identity Wallet by the EU. We got the revision of the EIDAS regulation agreed a few days ago, but a week ago about. And wallets will become a reality. And yes, for sure, there are 4 large-scale pilots on use cases for the European Digital Identity Wallet, and Signicat is in 2 of them. And we're following up, especially how to onboard to a wallet, how to use a wallet for signing, and also we're aiming at the attribute attestation role, where you can, I'm mentioning we have more than 100 different data sources. Some of them will qualify as authentic sources according to the EIDAS terminology. So we can gather information and we can issue attribute attestations into the wallet. That's one role that we are surely looking into. Yes, I'm looking into what we have. Will Signicat also service its clients in issuing data obtained out of onboarding to EID wallets? Yes, that was another question in the same area. Would wallets include carbon credits? I don't know. They will include lots of different stuff, including payments and of course all the different documents you can have. But there is also the European wallet has 2 parts. There's something called type 1, which is mandatory for all wallets, and then there's type 2, where you essentially can add different applications. So that's at least it could be added as a type 2 application to the wallets. Can you please elaborate more on the risk-based approach requirements? How would onboarding need to be adjusted, for example, selfie and one-time password? It's a good question. But you could imagine you have let's say you use an electronic identification means that are not notified. Maybe they are at good level, but you're not entirely sure about it. So you do the onboarding and the capture of the identity, and you say, according to risk requirements, we need something more. So you could ask the person, for example, please show us your identity document in front of the camera. You don't do the face video because you have the identity, but you then use also the document as an added evidence. That's one example. Or if you know the phone number, use a one-time password to the phone. So it is risk-based. If you think that and the risk is subjectively asserted by the financial service provider in most of those cases. So I don't know. I hope that exemplifies that. So I think that is what we have, unless Aquile working in the background supporting us. If you have any more, but I can't see any more questions now. Good. So lastly, let's mention a report that is fresh out of the press, or actually it's not out of the press because they always publish this digitally these days, of course. And that is a Forrester report we got from on what is actually the total economic impact of Signicat. We believe they have a huge impact on digitalization of services. What is actually the impact? So we did a study, and the main finding is 303% return on investment and 19% point increase in conversion rates, 75% reduction in fraud rate and operational efficiencies. So that's it. I mean, there are other suppliers providing excellent numbers as well, but this is really impressive, right? So urge you download and read. You can learn a lot about Signicat, and you can learn a lot about the identity topical area and what goes on and how this can impact your business and more efficient. I think that's it. Thank you to all attendees. Please get back to us, get in touch if you want to see more. I think also this webinar will be put on the Signicat website, so you can watch it later. You can point your colleagues to it if you believe it's worthwhile and they should see it later. Thanks.